Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Charity Charge Show. I'm your host, Stephen Garton. Today, I'm excited to have our guest, Laura Hope Whitaker, who is the executive director of Extra Special People. Laura, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, I know before we hit record, I was obviously asking you a little bit about your background. I know you've been with the organization for 20 years now, so congratulations on that. Can you talk to us a little bit, first and foremost, the mission and part of the vision of Extra Special People?
Yeah, so ESP exists to create transformative experiences for people with disabilities and their families. And what we know about that is it changes communities for the better. The way in which we fulfill our mission is we have experiences, which is after school programming, weekend events for people with disabilities and their families. We provide wraparound support to the family. So we have family events, family trips. We're taking 100 families to the beach in a couple weeks with a tractor trailer of beach wheelchairs. So we're wrapping around the entire family and providing experiences and support for them. And then purpose is the third way in which we fulfill our mission. And we have a social enterprise called JavaJoy, which is a mobile coffee cart that goes into businesses and organizations. And we employ, I think, currently 85 adults with developmental disabilities through our purpose part of our program, JavaJoy.
Awesome. And what was your personal passion, or why did you get involved with the organization 20 years ago?
Yeah, so my story is kind of non-traditional. When most people look at me, they're like, "How have you been a leader for 21 years?" I started volunteering when I was in college, but that really started when I was at home. So my parents, and now it's super interesting for me as a mom of 3 kids. My parents, I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta. They served on boards of directors. And so I grew up as a product of parents who got a babysitter for a board meeting and took us to volunteer. And so as a way of life for our family, I was surrounded with people who had different color skin, different people with different abilities. One particular nonprofit, it was an adoption nonprofit that my parents served on the board of. And so a lot of our friends ended up adopting kids, and some of these kids had disabilities. And so I think that, inadvertently sunk into the wiring of who I am. And then when I went to the University of Georgia, it was actually my ex-boyfriend who introduced me to ESP, the organization I'm with now. And I walked in, and it was a little 1,200 square foot building. And I'm an 18-year-old, and I'm consumed with comparison like every other 18-year-old. Like, who am I? What am I going to be one day? What am I meant to be in this world? What am I wearing? What am I driving? What's my bedding look like? And I walk into this unbelievable place, and I lost myself and found myself all at the same time at ESP. And that's how I got involved to begin with.
That's awesome. I really appreciate you sharing that. I connect a little bit in a different way, but really my founding of Charity Charge was rooted in my father, seeing how much he was involved with nonprofit organizations where we grew up in Baltimore. And he was on the board of a number of groups. One of them, he was the board president of for many, many years, which is now called Abilities Network, but it was originally named as Epilepsy Foundation of Maryland or Baltimore. And, I was super inspired by him. But then when I was in college, it was shortly after we just talked about before we hit record, he had passed away, and I was trying to figure out what the heck am I going to do after college, and really like grappling with how do I make meaning out of my life. And my university, Washington University, when I was walking through or the campus rather, the quad, they were constructing a new building, and they rolled out this huge banner that said this building to be LEED Gold certified. And I started researching that, and I learned about the world of sustainable building practices within real estate, and was just like, hey, here's an opportunity to, be enterprising, but also do good. And that kind of set me on a path, which this episode's about you, but helped kind of kickstart my passion for business, but that intersection of doing good.
Love it. There's like a triangle of connection there because I do think, for the parents that are listening, our kids might take a windy path, but at the end of the day, it's a reminder to me I'm a product of what we do today is what our kids one day display. And even if they take like a windy path, it's like they're watching us more than
Mhm.
they're hearing us. Like they're watching the behaviors of what we do. And if we care about our communities and our neighborhood and our planet, they're ultimately that's sinking in for them. And so I think that that's so cool that that came from your dad. And then the way I took the leadership helm was our founder was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And, here I am, this 18-year-old volunteering for this nonprofit. And I'm looking at this woman who's devoted her life to this organization and had built it to, at that point, 45 members, had built a small building. Her and her husband were very involved and thought, man, I want to be like that one day. She passes away from pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis until she passed away was only 6 months. And then I found myself at the helm of the organization as a sophomore in college. And so it's really cool to hear your triangle about your dad and how cancer then turned into something that is now your passion today, which is very similar for me.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. It's also a good reminder. I have our first child. He's 6 months old, and my favorite thing is, when I come into the room, he sees me and he smiles at me, and it's like, to your point of they're watching you. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, they literally are.
Yeah.
And it's really important to set a great example for our kids. So thanks for that reminder and touching on that. Coming back to the specifically the organization, extra special people. You had mentioned a few moments ago the 85 adults that you're helping now. I think that what I like to do a lot about this podcast is kind of frame up why the organization exists on kind of a fundamental basis and the gap. Because if you look back to the history of just nonprofit organizations and NGOs, non governmental organizations, they really were created by amazing people. Obviously, the founder that you're mentioning, because there was some gap in their community,
Yes.
or that they saw that wasn't being addressed or funded or helped with. So can you explain to people that aren't familiar with your organization or just the cause area that you're specifically in, what's kind of going on in the broader, and kind of what are the problems that are persisting, in the US, and how do you guys think about, the role of the organization to address that unmet need?
Yeah, I love that question, and I love tracing it back to, like, why we're here to begin with. And as a person of faith, it's always convicting to me that NGOs started because what was the church taking care of needs
Mhm.
became secular, and churches were no longer meeting the needs of communities. And so nonprofits started, social work started, and the outside community needed to step in places and spaces that the churches were no longer able to do so, or no longer choosing to. And so for us, what's fascinating is no matter where you are on the political spectrum, for us, the current statistic, 1 in 5 adults in the US have a disability.
Mm.
1 in 13 children have a disability. And if you talk to anyone, they know they have a cousin or a nephew or a child or a neighbor that's on the autism spectrum that has a diagnosed developmental disability. And I think the question that our country and every community is wrestling with is, what does belonging look like when you have someone with severe behaviors on the autism spectrum, or a G tube because they have cerebral palsy, or a tracheotomy? Like, what does that look like? What does that look like in the schools? What does that look like in the restaurant down the street? What does it look like at the grocery store when the bagger is helping with the grocery? Like, what do we do with that? And I think ESP is really at the forefront of what it looks like to build truly inclusive communities, not inclusive in the sense of the political word of inclusion, like truly communities of belonging. And the way that we do that, I shared what we do, but our business model is really about relationships. To give you the example, today, this afternoon, there will be 200 college students coming to our building and 125 individuals of all abilities coming to our after school program. And then there'll be 3 or 4 corporations coming to volunteer for our snack squad. And at the same time, there's a JavaJoy event happening at a local dealership. This is just one of our 5 communities. But what you see is not just serving people with disabilities. You will see those college students and how they are different because of their experience at ESP. You see the family being served in a really important way with after school programming, because there's not a lot of after school programming for people with disabilities, so they can't work. What you see is the corporation leaning in and volunteering and not just giving cash and investing cash, but investing time in their people and building the culture of their people, thus training and teaching their people how to engage people with disabilities, which helps them be better at customer service in their own businesses. And then there's a playground that's open to the public next to our Miracle League field where little 2 and 3-year-olds are toddling along, coming to our playground of possibilities. And they are building positive neural cycles on what it looks like to interact with people with disabilities. Thus, what research shows is they'll be more inclusive throughout the trajectory of their life. And so I think the problem at its core is we are isolated in our own silos and don't know how to interact with people who are different than us. The solution that ESP brings to the table is that we're creating these very engaging, very high impact, high touch, high relationship communities where it's not weird to see someone with autism and have a relationship or an interaction with them. And so that's been pretty beautiful to take a pilot of one here in Athens, Georgia, and now to have it see in 4 other communities how that ripple effect has happened in other communities as well.
It's amazing. Talk to us about that scale beyond Athens. What are the where are the 4 other communities?
Yeah. So we started here in Athens. We're serving a little over 900 members now in the Northeast Georgia area. Our first location that we grew to out of COVID was the Northwest corridor of the state of Georgia, which is in Rome. We're now in Atlanta, in the South Coastal region of Georgia and Savannah, and we're about to launch our 5th community. We already have a team there and families that we're serving in North Carolina and the Piedmont Triad area. So, in terms of growth, it's interesting. Nonprofit franchising is an interesting bear, and a lot of people have done it. And there's a lot of different models. We looked at all different types of models. We didn't grow for growth's sake. We grew because we had a list of 20 people that said, please come to my city. No, please come to my city. There's nothing like ESP in my community. And families were moving to our community because they didn't have it. And so during COVID, we stayed open. We ran 6 different campuses during that summer. Because if you have a child with a trach or a seizure disorder or severe autism, they were not learning online. Therefore, those our families were not working. And so we did camp really as a respite opportunity for our families. And so we had to do smaller campuses and 6 camp. And I looked at the very end of the summer and I said, we just figured out all the processes, the standards of excellence to be in 6 different places at one time. If we could do this in 6 different places throughout our community, could we do this in other cities? And that's really where our growth started, and now we're growing, which is pretty.
That's amazing. I wanna drill into some of those because you know, obviously we run this podcast, which I'm really proud about and I love doing for many reasons. And on our program side, we support over 3,000 nonprofits. And as it ties in directly to the podcast, the statistics will show that about 97% of all nonprofits are under $2 million in revenue. And I believe it's actually, if you kind of continue to look at it, 75% of all nonprofit organizations are under $250,000 in revenue. Could be off a little bit, but directionally kind of true. And so many of these organizations, um, they get started because there's a need, right, in their local community, as you talk about. And they have the passion and often the know how of how to serve, 1 person or 5 people or 50 people or 100 people. But the other things that the organization needs to have and build in order to be able to then start to think about making a broader impact, that can really hold back because you need to know things around fundraising, budgeting, forecasting, processes, systems, all of that type of things that, I kind of always think about it. It's why, the challenge that small business owners have,
Yes.
a small business owner really looks very much like the same background in many regards. Obviously, there's elements that are different, right? And then the question is, well, like, why do some small businesses go out of business, which the statistics are incredibly high, something like, 90, 95% aren't even around within 5 years later. So then what is it about that 5% or 10% that actually thrive? And most of them, by the way, even if they're still around, they're barely paying them the owner of the business or the founder of the nonprofit a livable salary, right? But then you have these exceptions. So what is it? And that's really kind of what I want to get into. Can you give us a perspective of when you think about, and maybe like full-time employee is not the right term, but how big would you say, when you include these four other geographic areas that you're serving, how many, people do you have collectively on your team?
Yeah. So to give some context of where we're at now, we have a budget around 8 million, and we have 50 full-time employees and 200 part-time employees.
Amazing. Yeah, and your founder started, and when you go back to when you were a volunteer in college, every organization starts just like every business. It starts with an idea and $0 in revenue, right? And I would imagine, I don't know what it was, but back then, 21 years ago, maybe y'all, were in the hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue, right? So
$125,000 a year, and we had a $50,000 deficit when I took that.
yeah. It well, that's g so let's start there. That's probably you're the guest, and I don't wanna, whatever your answer is whatever it is, but, in the truth, but, you said something there, which is you knew your numbers even back then.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, so it's not by magic that you got to 8 million. And so I'm just curious from your perspective, like, as you reflect back, right? Because you're also in a really rare spot to be with an organization for, over 2 decades. What were some of the building blocks to grow it, this substantially, both revenue to employees and obviously, ultimately the people that you're serving?
Yeah, I mean, you said something key there about knowing the numbers, and I do think it is, like, one of the biggest masks that nonprofits live behind is that we're a nonprofit. And, like, I like to remind my colleagues and people that I'm around, like, nonprofit is just a tax code. We're a business, and, we should operate as a business because our people deserve that. And so if we value our product, which is our mission and our people, then we should value our business and we should treat it like a business. So that has evolved over the years, but I really had to learn that. Like I didn't get a business degree, but I have learned it over the last 20 years. And so I think, knowing your numbers is super important. For me, on mentorship and still today is such a huge part of who I am, the fabric of who I am. I am a lifelong learner that believes in continuous improvement and that I should get better, that our organization should get better every day. I'm a strong believer in coaching and feedback. And so we run our organization that way. But at the end of the day, I knew even early on as a 19-year-old, like money is oxygen for us. If I can raise money, then I can hire more people. If I can hire more people, then I can serve more people. If I can hire the right people and retain the right people, I've got to be able to pay them well. And all of that trickles back to our product, which is our people. And so I really kind of became unapologetic in the very beginning about asking for money and sharing our mission and sharing what type of investment philanthropy is making in our community. And, I didn't have all the stories I have now. We have a world-renowned doctor at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta who has started autism clinics and is doing all this incredible research with autism. She would not be who she is if it were not for ESP because she was going to become a veterinarian. And she came to ESP and her perspective shifted. She declined her top vet school, went to med school, and is now the doctor that she is today. I can put that in front of a donor and say, this is what you're investing. I didn't have that when I was 19, but I did have our people and I had my story. And so I kind of became unapologetic about fundraising, about numbers, and business people want to talk to business people. So this is a generic statement, but a lot of donors that are out there are wealthy because they've been successful and they're successful because they're great at their craft and they're great at their business. We kind of like nonprofits, and I have done this myself, can kind of come in up with this mask of, well, we're a nonprofit and we're going to bring a sappy story. Business leaders wanna talk business. They wanna know numbers. They wanna know what is their ROI. They wanna know, what am I investing in? Where is it gonna go? When am I gonna be thanked? And if I don't get thanked, they're gonna take their dollars somewhere else if they're not stewarded well. And so, I had to, as a 19-year-old, quickly realize that I had to elevate myself through mentorship, through the help and guidance of people who have done this before. And still to this day, as our organization grows, I've never led an organization at $10 million before. I've never raised $8 million of capital in 1 year and have to turn around and raise another 10 million the next year. So I still am needing that level of mentorship to help elevate me as a leader and continue to bring my people up to grow as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but theoretically, over the 20 years, that's kind of been a common theme.
Absolutely. No, I thank you. I'm learning from you too. So I really appreciate that. I think that it is pretty interesting to see the some of the parallels in my story and yours and journey of me building Charity Charge and you building Extra Special People, because it is funny to look back and think about how, I mean, when we started this, like, I mean, I did know what the term CRM was, but we didn't even have a CRM. You know, we were putting stuff into spreadsheets and whatnot, and then no metric tracking, nothing. And we had our first mentor that I told you about before we hit record, who unfortunately passed away from pancreatic cancer in Martin, but he immediately said, you have to get a CRM and you have to measure. And he said, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And that was like as a not the starting point. But now, of course, there's decisions that I make and we make that are some of them intuitive or some qualitative, but none of them are made without looking at the math and using that as a guiding point. So some of them are, there's still sometimes we never have all the information, but we can make much better guesses and projections and all of that. And I very much feel for, at Charity Charge, the financial health and resilience of our organization is critical to be able to continue to serve and support, what we do, but we've got to take care of, our people so that this continues to go and go and go. One of the areas where I wanted to, um, I'm curious to ask you about, probably, I believe it was 2001. There's an entity which still exists today called Network for Good, and they had a grant. I actually think it was through AOL or AOL Time Warner, and they really pioneered online donating, right? And that was 2001. Thinking about the time that you took over the organization, there has been a tremendous shift in one, the rise of millennials, Gen Z, this like other whole other demographic, right? And then there's also been the rise of online and, other ways that nonprofits can bring in dollars. So I'm just curious, yeah, from your perspective, your experience, how has fundraising changed for the organization since from when you started there 21 years ago to today?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, it's
And then I would say things that have changed, but what
what
still has stayed consistent? Like, what are some of the principles that don't go away?
Yeah, I mean, I think immediately what hasn't, and I think this is like the largest percentage of philanthropy in the US is individual wealth. And I think
Mhm. I think it's 73%
yeah,
still,
somewhere.
something like that. Yeah.
And that has not changed in the sense of the practice of major gift fundraising is vital to what we're doing. And I think, philanthropists are getting younger and younger, and there's this inherited wealth now that we've got to figure out how do we continue to cultivate a donor that's no longer built the wealth but has inherited the wealth, and what does it mean
Yes.
for that person? And so I think that's the shift in major gifts. But at the end of the day, major gifts is still the same. It's people, it's stewarding people well, cultivating people well, helping them know what they're investing in, having a strong affinity to the mission, or building, for me, it's building affinity. Because if you don't have a connection with someone with a disability, I have to build that affinity, and that takes some time, but for the most part, that stayed the same. The technology side is fascinating because, to your point, we didn't have a CRM either. We've since, in the 20 years I've been there, been through 3. As the organization
I
grew,
feel your pain. We made a CRM switch a year and a half ago. It was awful.
it's painful. It is
Yeah.
painful. So that's interesting, and then online fundraising is interesting. I think the most interesting thing that's happened that's different is organizations that have figured out the marketing,
Mhm.
social media, and marketing as it relates to, what does that look like in 2026? And we're still trying to figure that out. But like at the end of the day, I had a mentor tell me one time, like, go where the people are. And like, where are the people? The people are online and the people
Mhm.
are on Instagram and the people are on Facebook. And so we have to go where the people are. The people are on TikTok. So that I think for a lot of the older leaders is challenging. It's like, oh, well, for a long time, it was like, "Oh, it's gonna fade out." Well, it's not social media is not going anywhere. You just gotta figure out how to craft it. And so that has been to me the most fascinating is storytelling as it relates to the mission, the impact of the mission, who you are, how you add value in that space. Because what's happening to nonprofits is you're not just adding value in the service you're providing. Now you're responsible to add value online to a whole nother subset of people if you want to be known and seen, if your mission is going to be visible. And so we at ESP are trying to figure out like how do we become thought leaders in our space? We already know we're thought leaders, but then how do we communicate that online so that we can be visible and pull in the next generation to learn from us, thus engage with us and eventually volunteer or donate. So yeah, I mean, it's really kind of fun. I mean, I love it. Like the evolution of
Mhm.
the AI, CRMs, I think it's messy, but it's always messy in the middle, and growth is messy, but it's also fun, and I think it makes us better at our jobs and more refined in our mission, and the people who don't learn aren't gonna make it.
Well said. Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you were talking about knowing your numbers, but what you also put across is that hunger to grow and learn and
Yeah.
continuous constant improvement, which is hard to teach. I think it's either in you or it's not, but even if the basics of it are, it can be developed as a habit. So that's awesome. Can I just ask right here? I was getting a little bit of echo. Can you still hear me fine?
Yeah, I can hear you great.
Okay, great. Okay, cool. I'm curious now your perspective. Something that's, I mean, that is separate from for profits to nonprofits is the requirement from a IRS governance perspective to have board members. So, how over the past 21 years have you worked to get the best board members on your board and get the most out of them? And part of that's asked too from a perspective, what I hear constantly from executive directors, whether it's on this podcast or it's, in private conversations, is their stress and frustration with their board if they feel that there's misalignment. Can you
Mhm.
talk to us about just your experience too and the importance, if it is important, to have a great board?
Yeah, yeah, I love that, and when I first took the helm, we had 4 board members. One was in jail for embezzlement of another nonprofit. The other was tragically lost her son, and the third and the fourth stuck around with me. One of them was a banker and taught me QuickBooks for the first time. Um, and that's kinda how the framework started, and the board at the time met once a year and basically did what our founder, Martha, wanted to do. When I took the helm, I knew I needed anyone who was anyone who had a vested interest in our organization to be on our board, because if we were gonna survive, I needed everyone bought in, and so I threw a bunch of parents on our board, and that was great for that season because, we had a $50,000 deficit, then we had to raise another $150,000, and I had to finish my sophomore year of college, geology being the hardest part of that, and a summer camp and all of these things, and so I surrounded myself with people who had a vested interest in our organization continuing. Fast forward 5 years, that was a problem because every person around the table had a vested interest and a personal interest in our mission, and, and a lack of the business acumen for us to grow, and so 5 years after that, we flipped the board and put a bunch of community members on it, and then 5 years after that, launched a capital campaign. We needed another elevation of a different type of board member, and so on and so forth, and now our board, um, is from all over, and cherry-picked to provide a certain level of expertise or support, and, board management is a significant part of of my job and of our jobs as CEOs, executive directors, presidents, whatever you are. And I think if you have alignment from the beginning, I don't envy a CEO or an executive director who inherits a board. I think that's like the most difficult thing. And if I walk into another nonprofit and were to take the helm of that nonprofit, one of the things I would negotiate at the very beginning before taking the job is interviewing the board and having a board transition within the next like, I wouldn't take the job if I couldn't because
Amazing advice.
yes, because I think I don't have a whole lot of business complaining about my board if I've chosen them to be on the board. If they're not a good fit and they don't have alignment, they need to have a hard, candid conversation, and they need to become a generous donor or volunteer and no longer serve on the board. And they should be donors, they should be helping plan events, they should be your moral support. So now I'm on the side of I love board management because these people are my team. They're a part of my team. They are adding value to what I'm doing. I mean, I talked to 3 board members yesterday about the very work. They're not a nuisance to me because I chose them, and they're a part of my team, and they have clear expectations of what their top 5 are and what I need from them for the organization. So, it hasn't always been that way, but I guess I would say I think one thing that executive directors get stuck in, and been in this place before as well, is you have this board that's underperforming. The organization needs to get to X and the board's holding you back. And there's this gap. And throughout the last 20 years, we have had a board that has evolved as the organization has evolved. And it's the only way the organization will evolve is if your leadership evolves as well. So it's okay to let board members go, I guess is what I'm saying. And it's not always pretty, but you have to grow, and this it's the same with our people. I mean, I've had people that I've had to let go within our organization, and that's very hard in the work that we do because they're passionate about our mission, but if they're not growing at the same pace as the organization is growing, then I think it's up to them to keep them around. So, that's kinda how I've done board management, and it's a lot, but I think at this stage, I wanna choose who the "a lot" is.
Yes. Yeah, I really appreciate that answer, and, it was insightful for me to hear from you before a leader is considering if they're interviewing to take over a significant role, specifically the leadership role at an organization, to get to know those board members first and then plan out in advance what that transition looks like, and then you can know if this is the right organization for you to step into or not, if they're not, willing to kind of understand in some ways like what your requirements are or whatnot. So that's really good. I think it's critical, like anytime you're stepping into any sort of new role, as much as like you show up to, you apply for the job or whatever, and they're interviewing you for you to interview them.
Yes.
Yeah.
The learning there was as we have grown, we have a champion board in each new community.
Okay.
They champion, so we have one 501(c)(3), but executive directors and separate budgets for every community. The executive director leads the local champion board. Well, in our first 3 communities outside of our original, these executive directors would inherit this champion board who's been working for the last 2 years to get the community going. So they have this vested, passionate interest. And then in comes this new leader that's all of a sudden responsible for leading them. So what we did differently in our 4th community is we were very clear with this champion board, like, okay, you're going to be the starters. You may not be the sustainers. Once the executive director is hired, they will sit down and get to know every person who has joined on the board and make a decision on whether or not it's a good fit for you to be a sustainer. And you all will decide that together. And then the ED has a say in who their board is and can build that team around that individual person. And so we've learned a lot since then, but I definitely wouldn't want to inherit a board that I knew didn't believe in me or I didn't have good rapport with. So I think that's important.
Awesome. I appreciate you sharing that. As we start to round out the interview, I'm curious for yourself, starting this or starting joining the organization while you were in college to today, as you kind of if you put yourself in a reflective mood, where do you think your biggest personal growth has come in what area to become a leader and a sustained leader for 21 years?
Yeah, I think it's in leadership.
What does that but yeah, what does leadership mean to you then?
Leadership I would boil down to one thing, which is just influence. And I think when I first took over at 19, I thought it was you tell or ask people to do things and they do it. And you assume that they do it and you give them, the benefit of the doubt and then they go do it. And I learned through a lot of very hard, and I talk about this in the book that I just published, some really, really hard leadership lessons about what people value and hiring character over competence and the importance of training and coaching. Like, I tell my kids, like, if the coach isn't yelling at you, you should be concerned.
Mm,
The coach is coaching you because they see potential in you. And then I think in business, a lot of times we like take the coach's hat off and we're awkward about giving feedback. And I did that for many years. I just kind of danced around people's performance. And I had a very high expectation for myself as a high performer, but I didn't hold that same expectation with my people. And our mission suffered accordingly. Uh,
mhm.
and so I had to learn how to lean in and have hard conversations. I had to learn to let people go if they didn't align with our culture or with the vision of where we were going. I had to learn to come back to the vision over and over again because as the visionary, I can see it very clearly where we're going. But most people on my team day to day can't see it. They need to be reminded where we're going over and over and over again. And so I've had to just lean into some of those harder things. I had to learn how to say I'm sorry, tell people when I need help. My big kind of 4 things are I look for people with hustle and hunger. I look for people with humility. I look for people that are hospitable and people that are hope-filled, can see something bigger than themselves, can see how to fill the cup. And I've learned that not everybody fits that and it's okay. And I have to either let people go or not hire someone, even if I'm in love with them, if they're not a good fit for our organization.
Tell us more about your book. What's the title?
Yeah, so it's called The Joy Exchange, life's greatest lessons and those you least expect. It's basically if you are in the world of nonprofit, it is all of the notes of everything that I went through, from the $150,000 budget with the $50,000 deficit to the $8 million budget and everything in between. It's the lessons that I learned. It's the way that I learned from the people that are around me, which I think are the greatest teachers, which are people with disabilities. Make you laugh, will make you cry. But at the end of the day, it's really a leadership and self help book through kind of a memoir style with lessons of what to exchange along the way.
That's amazing. Where can people find it?
You can find it on Amazon, Target, Walmart, what else? Barnes& and Noble. You can find it all online. I think it's sold out on Amazon right now, but I think they're printing more books, which is exciting. So,
That's incredible. I wanna figure out a way to host you in Austin so we can
yeah,
invite a bunch of nonprofits
come on.
to learn from you and maybe do a little event or something. That's super cool.
I would
That's
love
awesome. Laura, I really wanna thank you for coming on this episode. You've taught me a lot. I know anyone who's listening along will learn from it. So I really appreciate you taking the time. I'd love for you to also tell us that for those that are listening and want to get involved, support, learn more, how can they find more information around extra special people?
Yeah, well, you can go to our website, which is espyouandme.com or .org, excuse me, espyouandme.org. Specifically, you can find us on Instagram, ESP Inc., and my handle is Laura Hope Whitaker.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being a guest. I really appreciate it. And I remind and encourage everyone to charge it forward in everything you do.